Hello, my name is Nick Anderson. I write about higher education here for the Washington Post, and we're here today to lead a discussion about freedom of expression and free speech and the First Amendment on college campuses, and the role that universities and colleges play as forums or venues for expression, and some of the debate about that role that's arisen in the last couple of years. We've had a very intriguing period on college campuses of upheaval and ferment and protest about protests. And so with me to explore some of these questions are Christina Paxson. She is the president of Brown University. She is the 19th president of Brown and is an economist by training. She also has been president of Brown for the past 5 years, and she's seen a lot of protests in her time there. Mm-hmm. And to her left is Robert Zimmer. He is the president of the University of Chicago. He's a mathematician by trade. Also spent some time at Brown before coming to Chicago, was provost at Brown. And he is the 13th president of the University of Chicago, and he's been president there for 11 years. The two of them have staked out some interesting viewpoints about free expression and safe spaces, and we're going to dive into that in a second. But I want to just remind the audience that if folks out there are following us, that the way to ask a question is to tweet it. You can post a question to us using the hashtag #FreeToState. So we will be monitoring that hashtag, and hopefully during our discussion here, I will be able to grab some of those questions and pose them to our two presidents. Now, I'm going to kick off by talking about something that's happening on Capitol Hill today. We just noticed that the Senate Judiciary Committee held a hearing on this issue, and the title of the hearing that I read was Free Speech 101, The Assault on the First Amendment on College Campuses. Now, the First Amendment, of course, applies to public universities, and these are two private universities, so we're going to put that caveat out there. But there is a viewpoint, I think, expressed by the title of that hearing, The Assault on the First Amendment on College Campuses. And I wondered if I could just ask each of you to give me your take on whether this is an exaggeration, is this hyperbole? Why is this even being raised as a question? Is the First Amendment or freedom of expression under assault? Why are we here today talking about this? Why don't we start with you, President Paxson?
So thank you. It's not hyperbole, and I think there is a serious issue here. If you look at how much presidents are writing, university presidents are writing and talking about this issue, we wouldn't be doing it if there wasn't a cause for concern. There's really good polling data that shows that students, much more than in the past, will say that they think that it's okay for universities to restrict expression on campus, that it's okay to not invite controversial speakers. And for Brown, for Chicago, for most other reputable, probably all other reputable universities, we have very strong policies, whether we're public or private, saying that we have to protect academic freedom, which includes freedom of expression. It's central to what we do. You can't advance knowledge if you don't have an environment in which people can express and debate ideas. Mm-hmm. So we need to pay attention to this.
Mm-hmm. President Zimmer?
Well, I completely agree. I think there's a very serious problem, and I think it's widespread. And I think the thing one needs to bear in mind about it goes back to your introductory comments about the role of universities. And if you are actually considering the nature of education that universities should be aspiring to provide, it demands an environment in which everyone is mutually challenging each other. It is simply impossible to have an education in which students are gaining the types of skills they need in terms of understanding argument, being able to advocate, and many other skills that we've all talked about. It's impossible to do that in an environment in which one is not open to ongoing challenge, argumentation, discourse, and debate. So that's a fundamental issue. You just can't get by without it. Now, over a long history, there are ongoing challenges to that issue. This is not a new issue. It's an ongoing issue. And usually when people think about people not being free to speak, they're always thinking about people that they disagree with. There are very few people who will say, you know what, I think we should restrict speech. And some of the people I agree with and who are really forceful advocates for what I think are among the people that we shouldn't have. I've never actually heard anybody make that argument. So what that indicates is that what people are really doing is saying, I don't want to hear what people that I seriously disagree with have to say, or that I think are offensive have to say. And this is the ongoing problem that you have. And it's simply impossible to have an environment in which one segment of the university community doesn't like this type of speech. So you say, well, maybe that's okay. And then another segment says, well, I don't like that kind of speech. And what do you say to them?
So, President Zimmer, I'd like to ask you and President Paxson about something that the University of Chicago's Dean of Students wrote last year. It was rather provocative. He wrote to incoming students that, quote, "We do not support so-called trigger warnings. We do not cancel invited speakers because their topics might prove controversial, and we do not condone the creation of intellectual safe spaces where individuals can retreat from ideas and perspectives at odds with their own." Now, the reason people zeroed in on this is that your Dean of Students was going right after trigger warnings and safe spaces. And I wondered if you can tell us why. Why did your deputy on this issue feel compelled to go after those concepts? Was there something problematic about them?
Yeah, well, first, I mean, whenever one talks about trigger warnings and safe spaces, one needs to recognize that the words are being used by different people to cover a whole multitude of phenomenon. So they've become problematic simply because usually people start arguing about them without actually talking about what they mean specifically.
So we have a definition problem.
You have very real definition problems. The reason that these issues come up is that the nature of the balance of what is being done in certain places in saying that people need to be protected from speech has, in some people's view, and including mine, gotten way out of whack, and that you are fundamentally taking a notion like trigger warnings, which started for dealing with post-traumatic stress syndrome, and I don't think anybody is commenting upon the professional expertise of people who are trying to treat post-traumatic stress syndrome. But then the word segues into a whole bunch of other areas where it is very questionable that it's appropriate to have policies that actually apply, that people are supposed to provide these warnings.
Yeah.
President Paxson?
Well, I mean, the trigger warning thing is a very good case in point about the definitions and the need to define these things precisely. If you ask most faculty, do you use trigger warnings? They say no. And then if you say, would you ever occasionally give students a heads up if the reading for the next week has some disturbing material? Mm-hmm. And the answer is, yeah, I might do that. Mm-hmm. A good example, we have a professor who I was speaking to who teaches about the Holocaust. Well, there's some tough going there. And so she'll routinely say, this is coming up next week. Now, under the tenets of academic freedom, she has every right to do that. So our view on trigger warnings, if that's what you want to call them, is we give a lot of discretion to faculty to teach the classes the way that they think is most appropriate that's going to educate their students the best.
Yeah, let me add that.
yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, let me add that I totally agree with that. So that, I mean, there was one kind of misunderstanding about that letter is that faculty do what they want in their class. And so if somebody wants to say something like that, that's totally within their jurisdiction.
So you might support so-called trigger warnings in some circumstances.
What I'm saying is that faculty are in their class, do what they want. What I'm also saying is that having a university policy that says to faculty, they must consider these types of issues under these types of circumstances, and they must make certain kinds of representations and statements, that's totally off base as far as I'm concerned. Right. And so this is, again, part of the way where one needs to understand definitionally exactly what it is you're talking about.
Right. And I think, the issue of safe spaces, you also mentioned it.
Right.
That's exactly the same issue. We had what I thought was a kind of funny experience. My head of communications got a call last summer asking, from a reporter, asking if we had a safe space in every building. And we were like, what? What is this supposed to mean? That we have padded cells that are idea-free zones? It was kind of funny, but it helped me realize that when we talk about safe spaces, and frankly, most people on campus have stopped using that term because it doesn't mean anything. It's just thrown around as sort of an insult to campuses or to students without having any clear meaning.
So, okay, the criticism of safe spaces comes from, I think, a point of view that says that somehow colleges and universities are coddling their students, right? That they're protecting them from ideas too much. And I wondered, do you think, either of you, that students themselves are afraid of uncomfortable ideas? Do you think that they want this protection?
I have, and I'd love to hear what Bob has to say about this. We may disagree. When I look at Brown students, it's hard to characterize students. There's 6,000 of them. I don't see students who are asking for protection. I just don't. I see students who are very concerned about a set of issues in the world right now. They're concerned about racism, they're concerned about equity, they're concerned about politics, any number of things. They're not shying away from hard issues. So, their tactics for trying to get what they want sometimes aren't where we want to go. Shutting down speakers is not right. But I don't see students asking for protection because they're scared or they feel frail or fragile.
I'm less sanguine on that point. So, for example, after my editorial in the Wall Street Journal that brought this whole issue up, I received a number of notes from students at other universities saying that they wanted to say such things, but were advised by their fellows that they would be ostracized for saying such things. I hear this from students around the country all the time. I hear it from faculty all the time, that in fact they are nervous about what they have to say. And
are they students or faculty from particular points of view? Are they conservative points of view?
It depends on where you are. And I actually don't think I don't think the point of this issue is where. There's going to be some times where you're going to get pressure from the self-identified left, and sometimes where you're going to get pressure from the self-identified right. This is not an issue where there's some narrow focus of one group or another. At one particular campus and at one particular time, you may find that you're getting one particular type of pressure. At another campus at the same time, or the same campus at another time, you may get the pressure in the other way. And I think this is a very important point. It's too easy to turn this into a political issue which it fundamentally is not. And it goes exactly to this point that I made before, that people often do not want to hear people with profoundly different views. Frankly, I think it's incumbent upon universities to be cultivating an environment in which this is acceptable and important, and where people see it's critical to the own quality of their own education that happen. I will say that the ambient environment of demonization, again, in both directions, of people holding opposite views, doesn't help the environment on university campuses. But I think it's incumbent particularly upon universities to work very hard to foster this view, and it has to be purposeful because it's not natural to people.
So we have a couple of questions from the Twitterverse. I'm going to toss one out here from Helena. During the 60s and 70s, colleges were considered beacons of free speech, good and bad. When was the turning point in the climate? And were there any specific turning points in the last 5 or 10 years that you would point to?
You know, I think we have a bit of a tendency to glorify the 60s. And if you actually go back and you read the paper, there were violent campus protests. Actually, the Chicago Tribune in 1969 protested itself by taking a day off of writing about student protests, right? And you know, so it was not exactly a free speech, all ideas are equal zone. So, you know, I look back even farther in history, and university campuses have always been places where, you know, new ideas come forward. They have been places that reflect all of the difficult issues that we see on campuses. Mm-hmm. In the 1950s, we were grappling with McCarthyism. Mm-hmm. In the 60s, it was civil rights, it was women's rights. Now we're dealing with a different set of issues. So, you know, don't get me wrong, I'm not sanguine about what's happening now. Mm-hmm. And I do think that at each of these historical moments, we have to support and honor the fact that our students and our faculty, you know, they don't take the status quo for granted. They're pushing boundaries. That's their job. Mm-hmm. But we also have to make sure that they do that in the context where they listen to other viewpoints and where they don't go off the rails. But be a little careful of glorifying the 60s.
So I'm going to ask President Zimmer a question from Tyler. What is your view on hecklers and their veto power employed by some activists on campus? Should protests be distinguished from harassment?
Yeah, well, this is actually a very important point. So, first of all, protest is a absolutely legitimate form of free expression. So, any attempt to say that protest needs to be limited or controlled because of just not liking protest is just itself another example of constraining speech. So protest itself is absolutely part of what universities should expect and should embrace. It's a form of speech itself. Now, what you cannot do and what is not acceptable is to arrogate the right of free speech to yourself, to say, I can speak, but that person can't. The people in the audience can listen to me, but not to that person. So the heckling and disruption is arrogating to yourself the right of free speech and eliminating it for other people, and that's simply not acceptable. And that's a very clear distinction. Protest is great if that's what you want to do. We support it, absolutely. The minute you start taking away somebody else's right of speech, that's a problem. So disruption is a problem.
President Paxson, you confronted this issue a few years ago when New York Police Commissioner Ray Kelly came to speak, and there was what might be called a shout down episode there. Can you talk to us a little bit about that and what you learned from that episode?
Sure. So this was an episode that was about 3.5 years ago. In the recent spate of shoutdowns, it was probably one of the first and maybe more mild in a way. So maybe we were lucky. I don't know. We had it first. And to me, quite honestly, I wasn't expecting it. I was a relatively new president. It hadn't happened at Brown for a while. And clearly a violation of Brown's policies. So, we handled the way we handle violations of policies. We have student conduct proceedings, we follow them. And I think we learned a lot from that. I think we learned a lot just about the mechanics of event management, about how you make sure that you position the event, where you host it, who's allowed in the room. In the Brown event, it was a combination of students and members from the community, people from outside of Brown. And, that can be a problem, as we've seen at Middlebury and at Berkeley, where people come in who don't really care about our rules. And, I think in that sort of instance, we have the right to restrict to ticket events. So just things like that. The other more important point, though, was I realized that this core value of academic freedom, which I'd always taken it for granted, but then I'm an academic, so it's something I think about a lot. And what I realized was that our students coming in don't understand it, they don't appreciate it, and why should they? They haven't learned it. And so from that point on, I started talking and writing much more regularly about not only that you shouldn't disrupt events, but why? Why is it so essential, not just to a democracy, but also to a successful university? So those were good lessons.
So let's talk about safety and freedom of expression here for a minute, because this arose in Berkeley, where there was much discussion about sort of how to ensure that there weren't violent clashes if and when Ann Coulter would speak at Berkeley. And this issue of safety pops up, I think, again and again. Colleges sometimes ask groups for money to pay for the extra police costs and security costs. What's the right role for colleges to play in safety and in funding safety to ensure that speech can occur?
Well, I can give you a very concrete example of something that happened after the Charlie Hebdo incident, which is that a woman who worked there came to Chicago, was invited by a group of students to speak. It was the first appearance that this woman from Charlie Hebdo was going to make after what happened, and we needed a lot of security. And we often, when there's if a particular school wants to hold an event that is going to require extra security, we ask the school to pay for it. It's usually not a lot, and they can usually afford to do it. This was a student group, and I got a call the night before the event because the security precautions kept going up as word kept going out. And I got a call from a faculty member the night before saying we can't pay for it. I mean, the student group, they've tried to raise money, they can't do it. And I said, okay, we'll pay for it. And we did. So I think...
But that was a singular situation?
Well, I wouldn't say... I'm not sure what was particularly singular about it. I mean, it had singular qualities, but I think there's something to be learned from it in general, which is that it becomes very problematic if every time there's some slight security issue that becomes a reason for canceling. It can become a convenience, it can become an excuse, it becomes an easy way. Now, go to the other extreme. There are obviously, one can easily make up examples where it's just universities simply do not even come close to having the resources to provide anything remotely like a safe environment. And then you're in an emergency situation, which becomes quite different. But as with a lot of these issues, they're not totally abstract. And the question is, how are these things being used in a real way? Mm-hmm. When you really look at the concrete situations, is this something that is being essentially yielding to a type of behavior and mindset and attitude where free expression goes way down the list of things that are important, or is it real and serious and a true emergency? And I don't deny that there are situations of the latter, but I just think that it's very important that universities and colleges take this free expression issue as definitional for who they are and what a university is, just as Chris was describing. Why is it important? This is not a theological principle. It's how are we going to do a good job at what our mission is. We're supposed to be educating students. We're supposed to be encouraging research. How do you do that? Free expression is part of that. And so that being focused on that priority has to become a guiding principle rather than, well, yeah, we care about it, but gee, we've got all these other things we care about too.
So I want to ask a little bit more about the safety question from a slightly different angle. Sometimes people are concerned that campuses are getting hijacked by outsiders that are kind of pouring in to express their viewpoints. And I know that your private campuses, not public, so there's a slightly different set of issues there. But to what extent are universities responsible to sort of be forums for free expression from any which way that's coming onto campus? Or to what extent can they just sort of shut that off of campus and say, go somewhere else?
Well, I mean, as you said, the issues for privates and publics are somewhat different. And, you know, we allow anybody to come onto campus to speak if they're invited by a member of our community. Mm-hmm. And, you know, that's a good principle. And, you know, I try to keep events open to the public. I think to the extent we can do that, that's great. In cases of safety or security, though, I think it's appropriate to restrict attendance. There is this concern that campuses are becoming these battlegrounds for alt-left and alt-right groups.
Right.
And, you know, what do you do? Again, every situation you have to look at on its own merits, and you have to think about how can I keep my students safe while, as Bob said, maintaining the central idea that allowing people to speak is important. If you let outside groups shut things down, you're going to have a lot of things shut down.
But do you err on the side of letting the outside groups come in the hopes that perhaps that's itself is an educating experience for the students?
Well, I mean, again, it's really hard to answer that without being in a specific circumstance. Mm-hmm. You know, can you talk to the groups in advance? Do you know who they are? Mm-hmm. It depends on the specifics. It's very hard to generalize. Okay.
I'd like to ask one more question. I think there's a general view out there that sometimes people who are supporters of President Trump are not welcome on certain campuses, and their viewpoints are not welcome on certain campuses, and they don't feel comfortable expressing them. Now, you said that you don't want to politicize this, but how would you answer that quickly to folks who have that concern?
I think it's a concern. I think if you look around, the country, you see a number of incidents of these things being expressed, and I think it is a concern, and I think it's very unfortunate.
President Paxson, what have you observed?
I mean, look, it's no secret that college students tend to be more liberal than not. There's a UCLA poll that was done a year ago. 20% of new college freshmen identify themselves as being conservative or very conservative. So, you know, we have to do things to encourage students who are in the minority to feel comfortable speaking. That's really important. One thing we discovered after the election was, while our students may have been primarily not in the Trump camp, a lot of our staff were. Mm-hmm. And we have to think about how we can create a community of faculty, students, and staff where everybody feels like they're valued and respected, and that they don't have to hoe a certain political line. So I agree with Bob. I think that that's something we do have to watch out for.
Well, thank you very much. That's about all the time we have on this issue today on college campuses. I want to thank President Paxson and President Zimmer for coming to speak with us. And everyone in the room, thank you for watching, and those online, thank you for watching.